and welcome back to 80K Talks, the podcast from 80K Taste, where we explore the people, places, and stories that make the Adirondacks one of the most extraordinary regions in America. From hidden gems and historic places to outdoor adventures, artists, entrepreneurs, and community leaders, we bring you, or at least we hope we do, we bring you thoughtful conversations from across the blue line and beyond. Today, we're kicking off a special series celebrating women in agriculture in partnership with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Essex County.
Our guest is Rebekah Pierce, co-owner of J&R Pierce Family Farm in West Chazy. Alongside her husband, Josh, she's helping redefine what modern farming can look like through pasture-raised livestock, regenerative agriculture, and an innovative practice many listeners may be hearing about for the very first time: solar grazing. Sheep and solar panels may sound like an unlikely pairing, but together they're helping preserve farmland, support renewable energy, and create a more resilient future for agriculture in northern New York. If you've ever wondered what it takes to make a living as a farmer in 2026, or what happens behind the fence at a solar farm, this episode is for you.
Rebekah, welcome to 80K Talks.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start it with Rebekah 101. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into farming.
Yeah, so I always like to tell the story when people ask how we got into farming. I say very much by accident. So both my husband, Josh, and I, neither of us have a background in agriculture. Neither of our families grew up with it. I think they thought we were completely bonkers when we got started with this, which I think is probably a sentiment that most farmers can resonate with. We both grew up in the Adirondacks in the Lewis, Elizabethtown area. We went off to college. Josh went to Paul Smith's. I went to St. Lawrence. I got my degree in English, taught English for a few years, and then I decided to go out as a freelance writer. Around the same time, though, that I was making the transition from teaching into my current path as a writer and a farmer, Josh and I were also starting the farm. And so when we originally started the farm and bought our property that our home farm sits on, we didn't have any kind of notions of becoming farmers at all. We bought our property just with the idea that we wanted enough space for our dog to run around without being in the road. Shortly after we moved in, we got chickens and then we got pigs. And it's always funny because at every nexus and every stage that we come to with our farm, we keep proving ourselves wrong. So when we got the chickens, we're like, well, we have chickens, but we're never going to have pigs. And then we got the pigs. Well, we have pigs, but we're never going to have ruminants. And then we got sheep and then we got cattle, and it's kind of spiraled from there. So we started our hobby farm, as it were, in 2016. By 2020, we realized that this was something that we wanted to take more seriously and turn into a business. So the farm became an LLC in 2020. And then in 2022, we really had this kind of catalyst where I had left my teaching job and I was writing, full time and helping to run the farm. And Josh was also teaching, and he also wanted a way to transition out of teaching and into farming full time. And the biggest challenge with that is, as I'm sure probably all of your listeners will resonate with, is land is extremely expensive. And after COVID, it got even more expensive. And as first generation farmers, without any kind of land legacy, without kind of, that knowledge of what it takes to run a successful farm, we were really having to teach ourselves as we went along and kind of forge our own financial path. And what we found was that we were both working 80 hours a week to essentially keep what looked a lot like a hobby farm, if you looked at our finances, to keep that farm afloat. But the output of work that we were putting into it, we just weren't seeing the returns on it. And for us to do what we wanted to do, which was to graze animals on pasture, to follow, those core principles of regenerative agriculture, it takes land and it takes space. And we just didn't have that land access. So in 2022, the brothers that we have always bought our hay from for the sheep, and for the cattle, as we've expanded into cattle, they were putting in a solar farm, and they were excited about the opportunity because it was going to allow them, some funding for their retirement. Farmers are notoriously land rich and cash poor. And so they had the land aspect, but they didn't have a way that would allow them to retire. Their kids weren't necessarily interested in taking that over. And so solar was a great option for them because the farmland would remain in their name as they were leasing. It wasn't an outright sale. It would remain in their name. And then they thought that by convincing us, which it didn't really take a lot of convincing, but by convincing us to approach the developer to put our sheep on that site and graze that site instead of having it mowed, not only would that farmland remain in their family name for the generations to come, but it also would not be exiting agriculture. And that had an immense value, both for them and for us. And that was a very long-winded response to your question, but that's how we got started.
No, that's great. And I really want to get into the solar, where agriculture meets solar. But I just also want, because you sound like the accidental farmer, like it wasn't something you intended to do, but now you're here. What does a typical day look like for you and Josh?
I don't think there is a typical day. So it's very dependent on time of year, right? And then also what's going on that day. So in the summertime, so, we're recording this right now, it's end of July. We're very much boots on the ground, and it's rare for us to be at the home farm for long periods throughout the day. So I'm also, I mentioned before, I'm also a freelance writer. So my time is kind of split. So I spend a lot of time writing and then assisting with the farm as well. But so a typical day of solar grazing means we're driving to a site. So all of our animals are currently off-site grazing. We have sheep currently on a site in Franklin County, and then we also have cattle on a site in Franklin County. And so what we do is we essentially, when we're going up there to take care of the animals for the day, we're making sure they have food and water. And so we're refilling waters, making sure they have mineral. And then for the food aspect, we are moving them to fresh pasture. So this isn't necessarily an everyday thing, but usually every 2 to 3 to 4 days, we're moving them to a new grazing strip. So if you're on a solar farm, there's already that exterior, perimeter fence, which is another benefit for us of grazing livestock on solar farms, is that we don't have to finance that exterior fence. It's already there. It is very secure and very solid. So that's a capital expense that we're not having to foot the bill for. But we do, on the inside of the solar farm, we have it separated into separate paddocks or grazing strips. So the rotational grazing model that we follow necessitates moving the animals often, so they always have new forage to eat, and also because it helps maintain the best possible quality for the soil and for the animals themselves. The other piece of it is that because we're hired by solar companies, our priorities are not only making sure our animals are healthy and the soil is healthy, but also maintaining our contract requirements with the company. So basically, that's just ensuring that the vegetation doesn't reach a certain height where it's shading the panels, because obviously that's creating, a decline in what the panels are ultimately able to generate as far as electricity goes. So we also have to make sure we're fulfilling that contractual obligation and moving the animals frequently and kind of monitoring the vegetation to see what stage of growth it's at allows us to do that. Now, this varies a ton. People will ask us, well, how many sheep do you have on site? How many cattle do you have on site? Like, what's your stocking density? How often are you moving them? And it really does vary, right? Because a site that was built 5 years ago on a former tile hayfield, the vegetation on that is going to look a lot different than a site that was just built last year and was reseeded with a pollinator mix. So there's a lot of variability there. But generally, a typical day this time of the year involves just driving around to sites, making sure the animals have what they need, and then moving them as needed to make sure that vegetation is kept in check.
So can you just leave them there overnight if they're there for 2 days or 3 days?
Yep, they
You
stay
just
there overnight.
Drop off the kids and they do the grazing and they stay overnight, and then you take them to the next place.
Yep. So they're usually on a site for anywhere between, a week is probably the bare minimum, but there's some sites that we could graze, for weeks on end, and they don't come home. They just stay there. Our sheep will not come back to the home farm probably until Thanksgiving time.
Wow.
Depending on when, we get our first heavy frosts and how much forage we're able to stockpile. We don't bring them home until there's no food left for them to eat on those sites. And then they'll be home in the winter. We lamb right here at home. A lot of producers do lamb right out on pasture, even on solar farms. We don't, just because I think anybody listening to this knows the volatile nature of winter in the Adirondacks, and we would rather not be digging out lambs from 4 feet of snow. So we'll bring them back. They'll be here all winter. They lamb at home starting this year. I think the plan is to start end of January, going into early April. They lamb here, and then as soon as everybody's done lambing, they're back onto the solar sites and getting to work.
I don't want to sound like a rancher, but how many head do you have per site? How many cattle or sheep?
It depends on the site. So I can give you some examples, though, to help kind of ground it in some context. So right now we have 2 separate groups of sheep grazing. So one is a group of just our ram lambs. So 50-ish or so ram lambs. And those are all market lambs. So they'll go for meat in the fall. So they're grazing one site. And then on another site, we have all of our ewes and our ewe lambs. And there's a few ram lambs on there too from late lambers, but that's besides the point. And so that's many more. So that's over 200 animals that we have on that site. The reason why that site is stocked so heavy is because it's one we got on a little bit later in the season. It was still under construction. And so the grazing timeline was a little bit delayed there. So now we're hitting it hard to get that vegetation back under control because we didn't have the opportunity to hit that spring flush hard like we normally would. But that's pretty atypical. Normally, we don't have that many animals on a single site at a given time. As for cattle, we're only grazing 5 cattle on solar right now as part of a little bit of a pilot study that we're doing ourselves just to see, because there are not a lot of folks, we're not the only folks doing this, I should say, but there's not a lot of people grazing cattle on solar sites. And there's still a lot of fear in the industry about what that's going to look like. Like, are the cattle going to damage components? What kind of a grazing rotation works best for them on solar? And so we're trying it right now with our 5 animals. We'll up the stocking on that because the sites that we're on with the cattle are very understocked at the moment. We could definitely use more bodies out there. But we're still, we're only a month into this cattle grazing trial experience that we're doing.
What is it about the sheep that you think makes them well suited for this work?
There's a few things. So I think, sheep have always been seen really as the plug and play for solar sites. And a lot of it has to do just by the virtue of their size. They fit underneath the panels really well. You don't need to worry about them chewing on things like goats have always been kind of the example that the industry says they don't want on solar sites, although there are people who are doing goats on solar now too, which is cool. We are not, so I can't speak directly to that. But they don't have the tendency to chew, I think, like goats do. They don't jump on things like goats might. And then they're a lot smaller than cattle. So you can put sheep, I haven't found a site on even, some of the fixed tilt sites where the leading edge of the panel is very close to the ground. I haven't found a single site that couldn't be grazed with sheep. There are some that would be more challenging with larger animals like cattle, but yeah, sheep are very much the plug and play on solar.
When you were first approached about doing this, what did you think? Were you like, that sounds insane? Or were you like, yeah, let's do it? I mean, what did you think?
We were very enthusiastic about it. And I don't think I really had the shock value that some people might if they were first getting started with this, because I had written an article about it like 3 or 4 years prior for Acres USA magazine, where I had interviewed some of like the earliest folks who were doing this in the US, and they're actually right here in New York State. And so out of their work kind of sprang up the American Solar Grazing Association. So I was very familiar with this as a concept, and we were very eager to try it out for ourselves as well.
Well, it just sounds like, I think sometimes you hear objection to solar panels on farmland because you're taking up the farmland, but this is really like a great partnership because the people who own the solar panels and that property are helping to create energy, and it's also helping to feed your flock, as it were.
It's been cool to see kind of the ripple effect of benefits that this has had, and I always hedge it with, because a big criticism I get is, well, this looks cool, but this is such a small percentage of sites in New York and in the United States. And that's very true. But I think it's not going to stay that way for long. I think companies are realizing there's a lot of value in this. And obviously there is solar done right and there is solar done not right. And I think this is a great example of solar done right, because you are providing that benefit to the leasing farmer, right? So like the example that I gave earlier of the brothers who are leasing their land to the solar company. There's the benefit to us because we not only get land access, but we also get paid for vegetation management by the solar company, which is really helpful in years where you can't, where input costs, like this year, our diesel costs are through the roof. It's a nice hedge against the volatility that naturally exists in farming. There's also like the ripple effect that extends into the community. So just going back to the example of those 2 brothers, they're still selling us hay for the winter. They're getting the check from the solar company. As we, scale up our business, we're buying more and more hay from them. So they get that coming in. We also rent additional barn space from them in the winter. So they get that rent check from us every month. And then, we're also frequenting our local vet, our local feed store. The meat that we are producing goes to local stores and it goes to a local restaurant and direct to consumer to people in this area. And so there is this really cool impact that it's having beyond just what the sheep are doing on site.
What surprised you the most after you got started doing this?
I think what continues to surprise me, and in a good way, is that every kind of, misconception we have had, we're continuing to prove what's possible. And so what I mean by that is, and it's kind of funny because it's very, very much in line with what I said earlier, where we were like, we're never going to have pigs. And then, we're just going to have chickens. We're never going to have pigs. And then we're never going to have ruminants, because we're seeing that with solar too. And so I say, whenever I have these conversations with people, I say never, because people continue, farmers continue to push the boundaries of what we thought was possible. And we're seeing this very cool nexus of innovation where folks keep experimenting with new things, with new crops. Like solar over cranberry bogs is becoming really popular in, I want to say, Massachusetts. We're seeing cattle expanding. I mentioned goats earlier are now coming onto the scene, when previously everybody, including farmers, said goats and solar are a no-go. So it's been very surprising and very, very cool to see this evolve. And I wrote a book on agrivoltaics called Agri-Energy, Growing Power, Growing Food, that came out last fall. And I kept joking with my editor. I'm like, the problem that I'm having with this book is that every few weeks when I go in to make the next round of revisions, it's already out of date because people are doing more research and trying new things. And so I'm like, by the time this book is published, it's already going to be antiquated, but that's a good thing. I think that's a good problem to have.
What do you think this means for the future of farming in the Adirondacks?
I think, farming in the Adirondacks has traditionally been challenging, right? And I think that's true of farming anywhere. But I think in the Adirondacks, we have additional pressures that are maybe not felt as severely elsewhere in the country. So the pressures of climate, I think, the impacts of climate, and I'm not even necessarily just talking about climate change. I'm saying climate in general and weather in general, right? Because those are, distinct things. I think there's a lot of pressures there. Our growing season is limited. The economics of it, I think, are even more challenging in the Adirondacks than they are anywhere else. And so the benefit of this is that it's providing those additional revenue streams that I mentioned earlier, where we have an additional hedge against that unpredictability. The other benefit here, and I don't know how much we want to get into the environmental benefits, but one of the cool things that's being studied with solar right now is for the ability to extend the growing season. So there's this very common misconception that nothing grows well under solar panels, and that is just fundamentally untrue. I think, here in the Northeast, our pasture grasses are predominantly cool season grasses. So they don't particularly like being burned by the sun all day. So that bit of extra shade is actually beneficial. And we're seeing that the forage quality underneath the panels is not only of a higher quality for the sheep, it tends to have a higher protein and more digestibility. It also has a higher moisture content. So when we have a very dry season, this year hasn't been bad, but last year, last August was awful. Our animals were still very well fed under the solar panels, and you could actually see the line, under the panel and then in the alleyways. The alleyways were burned to a crisp. Underneath the panels was still healthy forage. So while a lot of the grazers we know were having to resort to hay feeding, we were not. We were able to keep them on pasture all summer. It also provides a little bit of a buffer as far as the edges of the growing season go. There's this one really cool study out of Alaska where they were showing that because of the added frost protection that the panels provided, they were able to extend their growing season by 3 weeks on either side, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I mean, you're talking a month and a half. And in areas like ours where we don't have a long growing season, that's really, really valuable in helping farms stay viable.
That's so interesting. I hope this doesn't sound, not naive. I don't know what the right word is, but, when people picture a farmer, I think sometimes they associate that with a male, old MacDonald. What has been, well,
not
old
Green
MacDonald,
Acres?
No, Green Acres, maybe, or maybe Mr. Green Jeans from Captain Kangaroo.
There you go.
But what is your experience? I'm curious because this is the year of women in agriculture. What is your experience as a woman in farming been?
That's a really good question. And I think one of the cool things about our particular, I guess you'd call it a niche within farming, is that it's very female, not necessarily female dominated. I think it still skews slightly more male, but we're a lot closer to that 50% mark. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we're a lot closer to that 50% mark than I think you might find with other sectors within the ag industry. And I'm not sure the exact reason for that. I think a big part of it is the land access piece and eliminating that as a barrier. And it's been cool because being part of this community, because it is, a smaller agricultural community than, say, dairy farming in the State, a very well-established industry. we've made some really great, and I have made some really great connections with females, other women that are doing this type of work, with researchers doing this type of work. And it's been very empowering to see kind of this opportunity for female farmers, and not just female farmers, but I think other groups that have traditionally been underrepresented in farming. There's a huge veterans community that's sprung up around this. And all sorts of things like that. So I do think that there's a lot of entry points for women who are interested in agriculture to use this as an opportunity to do so without having to have that generational, land wealth, quote unquote, but that generational assets in terms of land, in terms of knowledge and all those things.
How is this experience influencing your family? And what do your kids think about being on the farm?
So that was honestly a big motivation for us to take the farm from being a hobby farm into, a full-fledged business. So we have a son. His name's Lewis. He's 5, and he lives and breathes farming. You ask him what he wants to be when he grows up, and without a moment of hesitation, it's cattle farmer. And so there's been this really cool benefit for us that we're able to do this as a family and explore this together. And what's always interesting to me is that because we started doing this when he was, 2 years old, he doesn't know any other way of farming besides farming around solar panels. So for him, people are they're like, I don't understand. Again, there's all these questions. But for him, it's just so second nature because that's what he has always known. And that's very encouraging, right? Because I think, every time there are questions about whether this is a viable path for farming and whether this is something that is scalable, I always say, well, if you plopped a combine, one of our modern combines down into a field in 1750, everybody was going to say that was really wonky and crazy and probably not a good option too. But now we're just so used to all of these things, and we're already seeing it with this next generation. Like, he's just so used to farming around solar panels, he doesn't know any other way. So it's been definitely a net positive for him.
That's awesome. If people want to know more about your farm, do you guys have a website?
We do. It's just jrpiercefamilyfarm.com. It's pretty easy to find. There's no little ampersand in there, obviously, that we normally have in the name.
Do you have a farm store?
We do not. Nope. And the reason for that is because, I think I mentioned earlier, we sell lamb, beef, and pork are our 3 primary products. And all of that is going directly to the 2 stores we sell to, the restaurant, and then direct to consumer. So typically what we do is we sell things by the share. And so there's not, generally a continually running stock throughout the year. We do keep some lamb cuts in stock, but not enough for us to have a full-fledged farm store. But folks are welcome to reach out if they're interested in buying some cuts of lamb, or if they're interested in beef or pork shares or lamb shares as well.
Can you maybe explain for our listeners who are used to getting their lamb or beef or chicken at, their local grocery store, what's different about pasture raised and pasture fed meat and poultry?
There's plenty of good studies I could point to. I'm not going to speak about health benefits or anything like that. I think enough people have written on that and are demonstrated in the research, and I'm not a medical expert.
Right, and we'd have to add that disclosure.
Right. She is not a doctor. But I can speak more broadly, which is that the more you can provide for an animal in its natural state, and the more you can focus on the soil quality that is supporting the forage quality that these animals ultimately rely on, the fewer inputs are required, right? So we don't use, we're not certified organic. That said, we probably could be. We haven't gone through the process because it's a lot. But we don't use fertilizers, we don't use herbicides, anything like that. We're really just relying on good pasture and frequent movement. So we always say that movement and green grass and sunshine are really all our animals need. And that's obviously a very simplistic way of putting it, but, they're on fresh pasture. So they're moving often. They're not stocked in a barn. They're nutritionally satisfied. They are mentally, I guess, not mentally satisfied, but they are mentally stimulated because there's a novelty effect, right? And that they're always being moved to a new grazing strip. There's diverse plant species on all of those grazing strips. So, rather than just feeding, a bale of alfalfa, they're getting something a little bit different every time they graze. And so it's kind of like, I could feed my kid a steady diet of chicken nuggets and he would love that, but it's probably not the best health-wise, right? He needs a diverse diet. Granted, he's 5, so it is a lot of chicken nuggets. But it's the same thing with livestock, right? And so the more diversity, the more movement, the more you can focus on that nutritional quality, the healthier the animal ultimately is. And that does transfer into, meat that tastes better. And again, I won't speak to the nutritional benefits because I'm not a doctor, but all of those things do trickle down. And so we tend to find, and folks have told us, so this isn't just me doing some marketing, but tend to find that the palatability, the flavor is a lot better on pasture raised meat and poultry as well.
Yeah. I may have told this story on a different episode with a different farmer, but I spent a month in Italy I had a sabbatical, and we're in this small town. We rented a farmhouse in central Italy, and I remember going to the butcher, and the chicken was super yellow and not like that sort of fat, plump chicken that we see in our supermarkets. And, we got a roaster, we roasted it, and it was the most chickeny chicken it was delicious. And what I realized is, our poultry's, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this either, but, all the antibiotics, all the stuff that they pump into chickens to make them fat, to feed them, really has a negative impact on the flavor. And the reason why the chicken was so yellow, it was suntanned because it had been out in the sun in a pasture and then gotten underneath those feathers. And so, I just never forget that experience. And we had chicken like 3 times a week just because it was so, so good.
Yeah. And I think, especially when you're talking about like ruminants. And so you'll often hear, and you may have come across this yourself, and maybe you have opinions yourself on it, but folks who are like grass-fed beef and lamb isn't as good as grain-fed. Like, it doesn't taste as good. And I always push back on that because I really prefer grass-fed. But it is different, right? Like, it's not the same as grain-fed. But what's interesting with the lamb especially is I did not like lamb at all. And so when we first got sheep, I told my husband, I'm like, well, we can raise sheep, but I'm probably not going to eat it because I've had lamb. I don't like it. But what I had was, imported Australian lamb that was grain fed in a restaurant. And then we got our grass fed lamb on our dinner table, and I love it. Like, I can't get enough. And so I think there is a very significant flavor difference there. And whether it's, the right choice for everybody, like, that's a matter of personal preference, but I do prefer the grass fed, as much as possible.
I was reading some of your blog posts, and the phrase, fresh air and sunshine, you use that a lot. What does that philosophy mean to you?
Just what it sounds like, right? So, I mean, obviously we live in the Adirondacks. Like, our animals are not on pasture 12 months out of the year. We would have some sheepsicles, I think, if we did that, but to the greatest extent possible. And we're not purists by any means either. We feed grain as needed. It's a great training tool, in particular. But we do believe that to the greatest extent possible, we need to give animals, what they biologically need to be healthy, which is fresh air, sunshine, and good forage.
When you talk about your son, it made me think, you're raising animals to be eaten. Was that a hard concept? I've heard some people speak about, like, don't name your food. Like, if you're raising cattle or sheep, do not become attached to them. How has that been with your son?
So he actually, I think, continues to astonish people because he doesn't have, and I think a lot of this is because it's all he's ever known. He very clearly understands the distinction. We bought him for his 4th birthday. We got him a bottle calf, a red Angus bottle calf. And he named her Tina. And she has been his cow since day one. He's had her almost 2 years now. And, we were very clear on the fact that Tina was going to be, a heifer that we would breed. She would have babies we would raise out for meat and sell and all of that. But Tina was going to be like a farm fixture. And so, we have, some of our breeding animals we do name because they are animals that are going to be around for the long haul. But we're also, we're raising them with the understanding that, it's not going to be forever, and, they all have a purpose, right? And so I think sometimes, and I can speak very candidly on this because I actually used to be a vegetarian before we got into this business that we're in now, and I started seeing the benefits of, homegrown meat and all of that. And, I think it is very easy to get attached to the animals, and it can be hard, right? Like, we've had animals that, lived out all their days here. And then, the day that they passed, it was hard because they had been here for so long. But I think that the thing that I always tell myself, and I tell this to anybody who is choosing to eat meat, right? If you are concerned about animal welfare, then these kinds of relationships with animals is really the best way to ensure that their welfare is being provided for. Um, our animals are well taken care of. Um, we are making sure that they are living their best possible lives and they have one bad day at the end. And so that's really all we can do, right? I mean, is just recognizing the role that they play. And our son has done an amazing job of being able to recognize that nuance, because it is a very nuanced thing that I think adults often struggle with and grapple with themselves. But he's always done a phenomenal job of being able to place that accordingly in his brain.
That concept, I think for me, really, when I read The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan many years ago, like that's when it sort of hit me. And in fact, I was living in the Midwest at the time, and, he goes into a long detail about, cattle, I forget lots, I forget what you call them, feedlots or whatever. And I lived in Kansas City, and those places were, within a half-hour drive from downtown Kansas City. And, I firmly believe that if you're raising cattle or any kind of poultry in a humane way, that the food is better for you. Happy critters make good cheese, as Sheila Flanagan from Nettle Meadow Farm told us. But I really firmly believe that for you can raise cattle in a humane way, and I think that's great. How do you think farming in the Adirondacks is going to look in 50 years?
I can tell you what I hope it looks like. I don't think any of us have a crystal ball, but what I would like to see is, I think we are seeing a lot more, small regenerative operations. Often it's young couples, young families kind of springing up in this area. I think we are seeing a lot of the, larger farms either consolidate, or, those folks are retiring, for better or for worse, right? We need all the farms we can get. But what I would like to see is this continued trend where people are trying new things and finding ways to make their farms financially solvent that don't rely on, that are as non-centralized as possible, that aren't relying on, federal grants or things like that. Because I think that's one of the sticky wicket that we've gotten into with a lot of small farms today, and especially starting farms and then young beginning farms, is they tend to be a little reliant on things like grants and loan programs. And I'm not saying those things shouldn't exist. I think we absolutely need them. And I think it's great that we have those for folks to tap into. But at the same time, I think farms need to find a way to innovate and to diversify and to figure out new products to sell and figure out new ways to farm and embrace new technologies and find what makes sense for their individual operations, kind of independent of what's going on federally or at the state level. We need to make these food systems as local as possible. And the best way to do that is just really to trust farmers to know what's going to be the best choice for their farms. I always joke around that farmers can fix anything with a little bit of baling twine and duct tape. We just need to get out of their way and let them do it. Let them figure out how to best work with the land and remain solvent for years to come. And that's true everywhere, but I think it's especially true in places like the Adirondacks, where we really have that homegrown spirit and that sense of place that really defines the region.
Did solar grazing become like a tipping point for y'all? Did that make a huge difference between, is this really going to work and we can make this work?
It did. Yeah. And that's not to say that, we'll solar graze forever. I think this is something that we will want to do for as long as possible. We're also looking into, putting solar on the home farm and finding ways to kind of offset some of our energy use there as well. So we'd like to do it as long as possible, but it absolutely was that, entry point that made full-time farming possible for us. Prior to these relationships, like I said, we were both working multiple jobs just to keep the farm afloat. So I can confidently say that had we not been able to break into this, we would probably still very much be farming on the hobby scale and losing a lot of money doing it.
What's the best thing our listeners can do to support local farms?
I think the first thing is to develop that relationship with your local farmer. Ask the questions that you have about how they're raising food, about why they're making the decisions that they're doing, and just keep the conversations going. And also, support at a broader level, obviously shopping from a local farm is the best way to kind of inspire this grassroots change, but also, at a policy level, look into ways that your vote can help support things like expanded processing access at, with slaughterhouses. That's a huge barrier for farmers in the Adirondacks is we don't have enough processing capacity. So, support those sorts of common sense initiatives that not only make it easier for farmers to farm, but help ensure that they're going to be around in the long run. There's so much talk about like, how do we protect our prime farmland? But really there's no protecting prime farmland without protecting the farmer. And so we need to ask the farmer, like, what do you need to make your business more solvent? And then support solutions that help them do that. And then again, just shop local as much as possible.
Yeah. Easier said than done. We have a lot of listeners that are in the New York City area and the metro area. But there's farmers markets in all those places. There's Wegmans and Hannaford often highlight locally produced stuff. If I try when I'm shopping to look for things that are, whether it's milk or whether it's eggs, Stewart's has some of the best milk and it's all New York State cows. So it doesn't take a lot of effort to support your local farmer.
There's some cool, and we're not doing this just because, we're sold out pretty much. We sell out very early in the season. So we haven't had a need to find a way to expand our markets yet, but likely this is something we'll end up pursuing. There are a lot of like online delivery services that are now springing up and specializing very much in like the type of products that we are producing, and they ship directly to people's doorsteps. So serving as a liaison between the farmer and helping with, how do you keep things cool in storage and all those sorts of in transit and all of that. And all those sorts of things that help remove a lot of the barriers for, why farmers don't tend to ship products more. So those are also worth exploring for folks too.
Is there an opportunity? I know you don't have a farm store, but can people visit the farm?
Yeah. And I always tell people, like, if you want to come visit our home farm, there's not much to see this time of year. We have, our pigs that we're raising, and we raise those on a kind of a woodlot, a pastured woodlot. So we have, pigs. We have a handful of goats that are keeping the brush cleared down. And then we have, just a handful of meat chickens, but that's pretty much it on the farm right now because everybody's off grazing. But come, fall, winter time, people can stop by. And then, we also, the other opportunity that we've been, encouraging people to take advantage of lately, is to set up a visit with us to come see one of the solar farms. If you want to see how solar grazing works, we're always more than happy to entertain guests on those sites and just clear up some misconceptions, answer questions, and just let people see how that works too. So in the summertime, that's a good option for folks as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Rebekah, you mentioned that your products are available at a local restaurant and a couple stores. Would you like to mention those so our listeners could know where they can sample the goods?
Sure. So if you're in the Plattsburgh area, we sell lamb to the Twisted Carrot, which is a phenomenal restaurant right in the downtown area there. And then we also sell to Nori's in Saranac Lake. And then we try to keep lamb in stock. It goes pretty quickly, but we try to keep it at the food co-op in Plattsburgh as well.
That's awesome. Steve went to SUNY Plattsburgh, so he knows it well.
Oh, yep. Got my master's degree there.
Good for you.
Well, this has been a terrific episode, Rebekah. So informative. I've loved listening to your story and everything that you're doing with solar grazing. It sounds really amazing. But before we release you into the wild, as we like to say, we always ask our guests to share a favorite place in the Adirondacks. And it can be anything. It can be a hike or a paddle or a swimming hole or an ice cream stand, a museum, a theater. What's one of your favorite spots?
So there's a lot.
People have trouble saying just one. So if you have more than one, that's okay too.
I'll give you my number one. And it's probably going to sound like a weird answer, but I'll try to provide some context for it. So maybe it doesn't sound so weird.
We like weird.
Okay. It's very specific. So if you are driving from Elizabethtown to Keene or Keene Valley on Route 9N, I believe it's 9N, and you come up down Spruce Hill, and then you get to the bottom of Spruce Hill, and there's this big field, and then there's this beautiful like mountain vista in the background. And there's a few reasons, and for whatever reason, I'm always interacting with that space really from my car. Like, it's not like I'm not hiking there or anything like that, but I just love that spot, because it's beautiful. Every year I try to run. I enjoy running, like that's my hobby, and so I always try to run the Doc Lopez half marathon, which goes up Spruce Hill and then back down into Elizabethtown. And I love that part of the race. I love driving through there, and I think it's because it's just this cool, like you're at a T intersection and you stop and you just have to pause and just take it in. And I think it's accessible for anybody who's in the Adirondacks just to pause and take a breath and look at it. But it also represents kind of like this cool intersection of, I guess, development would be the best word for it. Human, the human experience. You're on the roadway and you're paused and you're looking at this mountain vista, and then you have these very wild spaces before you. And I think it's very indicative of the Adirondack Park as a whole. We have this idea of the Adirondacks as being this very untouched landscape. But the reality is, people live there and people are making a living there, and there are people living there, like us, like our families lived there for generations. And so I think, when we have conversations about what does the future look like in the Adirondacks, I don't necessarily think it's just this like isolation between human and the wild. I think it's very much, how do we interact with the landscape in a way that continues to add value rather than extract value out of it? And for me, that spot is just a great spot. And I always think of that whenever I'm stopped there, waiting to turn left or right. And it's, it's just beautiful is the very easy answer.
Yep. I love that. And I think, just to add on to what you said, one of the reasons that we started ADK Taste and this podcast is I do think people think about the Adirondacks as, the forever wild, the hiking, the paddling, all of those things that are incredible here. I mean, it's world class. But there are people living here, and there's more to the Adirondacks than just that. There's farming. There's the arts organizations. There are, restaurants. There are shops. There's crafts people. So we try and bring all of that to our listeners and our readers so that they can fully experience all the amazing things in these 6 million acres. We say it all the time. There's something here for everyone. So
absolutely.
That's great. Rebekah, thank you again. It's been lovely speaking with you, and I'm going to take you up on that offer and come see your sheep grazing on the solar farms.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you do.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you guys for having me.
That was a lot of fun. I think one of the things I love most about doing these episodes is that, it reminds me constantly that there are fascinating people doing really remarkable things here. And I love being able to share that with our listeners. And frankly, if we don't have any listeners, it's just you and me, I love learning all this stuff too.
Yeah.
It's fun for me.
Oh, it's neat. And this episode in particular, because it's given me I'm now craving lamb chops.
Yeah. And, I think that I loved how she talked about, being innovative and thinking, what can we do next? What can we do differently that will help our farm continue to be viable? I thought was really inspiring.
Yeah. And it's also kind of, it was interesting how the solar panels are interwoven.
Yeah.
Not just part of their business, but how it affects the landowner, how it benefits the other farmers who lease their land and are getting revenue from not just the solar energy produced, but also from the grazing. And so it's one of those things that helps more than one.
Yeah. I mean, it helps the energy company. It helps the farmer or the landowner leasing the panels, and it helps feed their animals. So I think that's really cool. I love that.
And if you think about it, whoever the energy company would have to pay someone to come out, and they'd come out with gas-powered mowers and weed whackers, and it eliminates all that noise pollution and air pollution.
Noise and air pollution, yeah, 100%.
So almost a triple win.
Not almost. I would say it definitely is a triple win.
Oh, it definitely is. And I was thinking when we were talking, because they are one of quite a few farms, some of whom do have stores, and a lot of people come to visit the Adirondacks with a cooler in their trunk full of beverages and food that they intend to eat during their stay, and then they go home. It's probably mostly empty. And so if you visit a farm store and you want to bring back the products of the the local farmers and cheese manufacturers, you can do so. You avoid the shipping charges. Just buy an extra bag of ice for the ride home.
100%. Or stop at Stewart's and buy one.
Or stop at the Crossroads, or stop at...
Or the Crossroads, or yeah. Or Pines, or Hosses,
Exactly.
or Charlie John's. So, all right. Well, listener, I hope you were as inspired as we were. And definitely check out J&R Pierce Family Farm and their website. They're also on Facebook. And, as Steve says, support the incredible farmers who help sustain these communities in the North Country. And if you enjoyed this episode, we'll hope that you'll support us by subscribing, rating, and reviewing 80K Talks wherever you listen to podcasts. It really does help more people discover our show and all the great things there are in the Adirondacks.
And if you have comments, questions, observations, or suggestions, you can send them to us via info@80ktaste.com. Also, you can find this episode, our complete archive, and our weekly newsletter on our website, 80ktaste.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, there's always more to discover in the Adirondacks.
That's right. Thanks, listener. We'll see you out there.
Bye-bye.